of Political Science and Director of a National Security Studies program, Dr. Mark Clark. Dr. Clark, good to have you here.
Thank you, Greg.
Now, Dr. Clark, you're author, along with Dr. Ross and Ken Samples, who was here in our last session, of a book entitled Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, a rational Christian look at UFOs and extraterrestrials. Now, this is published by Nav Press. And by the way, if our viewers want to read more about what we're calling the rUFO hypothesis in more detail, you want to get a hold of this book that you gentlemen have written. Now, we began our series discussing your theory that the vast majority of UFO sightings have very natural explanations.
That's right.
Misidentified man-made phenomenon, hoaxes. And you also believe, however, even though some can be explained by those means, there is still this 1 to 5%, which really is a large number, as it turns out, that we're calling those leftover UFO sightings, or rUFOs, residual UFOs.
That's right, Greg.
Now, in the last episode, we began considering the extraterrestrial hypothesis. This is the idea that we live in a universe which is just teeming with life. And unfortunately, this theory has run into some serious problems because the statistical improbability, first of all, of finding another planet anywhere in the universe capable of sustaining complex life forms is virtually nil. We've also considered some of the physical problems, even if life did exist somewhere else, making it virtually impossible for long-distance space travel. Now, a second aspect of the extraterrestrial hypothesis has to do with what does the government know about UFOs? And this is why we brought you in, Dr. Clark, because this is your specialty. When the popular media talks about government cover-ups of UFOs, there are three topics that come up, three things that are mentioned: Roswell, Project Blue Book, and Area 51.
And of those three, the two that have gotten the most play nowadays are Roswell and Area 51, for reasons we'll talk about.
Yeah, and we'll get to those in a few minutes because they're very important. We heard, Mark, in the introductory segment of this session, your theory of what happened at Roswell. And this was New Mexico, 1947. A lot of people know about this particular incident. Do you think that most UFO sightings have natural explanations like the one you offered there, in this case military aircraft that was classified?
I'm not sure the most, but I would say a substantial portion of them are military research aircraft, for reasons we'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, I think there's a substantial fraction of them are military aircraft that are misidentified as UFO phenomena for reasons we'll talk about. But it's really fascinating. There's a recent report out now that talks about triangular-shaped aircraft being spotted, and they're always in corridors in which you have military installations from one point to another. And so that's the more kind of ubiquitous phenomenon that's being reported.
The stealth bomber has that shape, that triangular shape, and this is the kind of thing that a lot of people are seeing right now.
Precisely. That and the F-117, the fighter, stealth fighter that was used in the Gulf War so effectively, also has that shape, though a little bit different, and we can discuss that further.
Okay. Give me a recap very quickly for our viewers of your view of what actually happened in Roswell.
Well, about June 24th, 10 days before that, June 14th, 1947, something landed, or something crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. About 10 days later, you had Pilot Arnold up by Washington giving the first modern sighting of UFO phenomena. A guy by the name of Mac Brazel, whose ranch is near this area, happened to discover this material. Didn't think much of it, but went back after the reported sightings by Pilot Arnold. Went back on about July 3rd or July 4th, found this material, and brought it out, the material that we discussed in the opening segment. Major Jesse Marcel was the base intelligence officer at Roswell, and he and a couple of others reported in the media that they found a crash saucer. Well, it came on the heels of Pilot Arnold's report. And so they interpreted the tape markings that were on there. And this is Scotch tape that was discovered in New York, a New York toy company, calling it hieroglyphics. They didn't have a context or a notion of what was really going on. And the reason for that is that there was weather balloon experiments being conducted, but there was a secret component to that whole event. And this was reported by a fellow by the name of Dr. Charles Moore, who happened to be on that project. But he didn't report this until 1996. He did not even know the name of the project. It was later called Project Mogul. And what it was designed to do was to be able to detect Soviet nuclear detonations acoustically by being on these lofted weather balloons high in the atmosphere and be able to detect them. We were looking for ways to detect what the Soviets were doing. And so all this comes out much later. But the initial event was just about 5 pounds of material, leftover material, very small things.
But as I understand it from your writings in the book that you have co-authored with Ken Samples and Dr. Ross, that all of the particular physical evidence can be traced back to domestic sources, like the tape going back to New York. It's just tape that was used to fasten some things onto the balloon, and it had these little figures on, like.
And it had aluminum foil reflectors so that they could detect it with radar, so they could track where the balloon was going, and balsa wood because they wanted it light to be able to loft up.
Well, you know, why is the U.S. government so secretive about these issues, Dr. Clark? I mean, sometimes it seems that these UFO trends are supported by these sightings that could easily be explained if the government would just come public and tell people, that's us, not them, that's up there.
Well, there's a couple of things. There really is a conspiracy, and I'm going to put it in those stark terms. There is a conspiracy by the government, and the conspiracy is to deny information to our enemies, particularly the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but even to, say, for China today, and other countries that have adverse interest with respect to us. So in a sense, there's a conspiracy, and the conspiracy is to keep silent on a lot of our research and development.
Which is the same conspiracy virtually every government has in terms of its national security.
Absolutely, and it's obliged to, by law, to defend the interests of the United States. So they're obliged to find ways to do it. Why we have this system of classification is because, well, for example, let me take a step back. Anything to deal with intelligence issues, that is the collection of information from another country, is one type of clearance, and that's called SCI, or Special Compartmented Intelligence. The other kind of information, that is on nuclear weapons, say, that we do not want the enemy to know, we're protecting our secrets and not trying to exploit others, is called ESI, Extremely Sensitive Information. So if you go into government, you're required to take either one of the or the other. Very few people get actually both of those clearance systems. And you're obliged, once you take this, you're taking an oath to protect these secrets for as many years as the government says they need to be classified. And so for a number of reasons, the government does not want to, it can't explain it.
For security reasons, their hands are just strapped, is basically what you're saying. And though they could clear up some of this confusion or speculation, there's a greater good to be accomplished with security.
Sure.
And this is why they're being careful about that.
And there are some who say that we keep too many secrets. And that can be debated. I don't doubt that that's a problem. A number of these issues are probably not nearly as secret as they need to be kept. But when you talk about high-tech military stuff, we're trying to deny spies from finding out what we're researching and what we're doing. And for example, in the 80s, there was a great tactic by Soviets, and the Soviet people that supposedly worked in their aircraft industry were coming over for just normal tours of Lockheed Martin, Boeing. But what was discovered was that planted among them, there were certain KGB agents. And what they were doing were actually GRU, military intelligence. And what they were doing is they had sticky soles to their shoes, and they would pick up the materials that were shavings from the material that we're developing all throughout the 70s and 80s.
So security is a very important consideration here, and this is why the government hasn't, maybe appearing to have a conspiracy to cover up UFOs, and they're just really have a conspiracy to protect their interests in terms of defense and the like.
Sure,
national security. But what about Project Blue Book? Wasn't this an attempt by the government to try to track some of these UFO things and explain them?
Well, actually,
and some would say maybe explain them away.
Sure. Well, that's the biggest charge against Project Blue Book. That some of the people on it said that, or around it said that this was a way, a rationalization to explain away UFO phenomena. But what in fact happened? There was two projects that occurred earlier: Project Sign and Project Grudge. And both of those were attempts early on to find out and discover whether there was actually not so much UFOs, but whether the Soviets were conducting high technology experimental aircraft. And so what they were looking for, you know, you imagine this is the Air Force. It was born in 1947. We had the Army Air Corps before it. It's a new institution, new branch of the military.
They're trying to justify themselves and
they have to
show themselves to be important.
And they do, but not initially. And so what they're doing is they're looking at to determine whether this is a real phenomenon, it's real by the Soviets, and it's a threat to the U.S. In Project Sign and again in Project Grudge, both times they deduced and concluded that it was neither a real threat or a real concern. Now what happened with Project Blue Book is typical of any bureaucracy that gets started on something, they get stuck with it. And the Air Force, because they're responsible for aerospace, was stuck with this all along, and they reluctantly were forced to take on Project Blue Book, which began in the early 50s. And Project Blue Book became for them, the bigger concern early, if you remember, was the McCarthy era, okay?
Right.
There was a great heightened concern about Soviet behavior, communist behavior.
Right.
And in Project Blue Book, what they were more afraid of at that point, since they determined that this